The 29th of October, 1946. Arlington Hall, Virginia. Rain lashes the windows of a drab converted girls' school just outside Washington, D.C. Inside, rows of analysts hunch over typewriters and cipher machines, their fingers raw from repetition. This is not a flashy agency. It's not even called the NSA yet. It's the Signal Intelligence Service, an obscure, overworked cryptologic unit tasked with decoding enemy transmissions. At 11:23 p.m., a Soviet diplomatic cable is intercepted from New York to Moscow. It looks ordinary. Encoded in the same Cyrillic one-time pad cipher used for years, supposedly unbreakable, supposedly perfect. But something's different. A young cryptanalyst, named Meredith Gardner, notices a repeated key stream, a number sequence that shouldn't be there, a violation of one-time pad doctrine, and that's the moment it begins. One phrase becomes a sentence becomes a paragraph. Within days, the Americans have unlocked a message referencing a Soviet asset working inside the Manhattan Project. Not theory, not rumor, confirmation. The Soviets had a spy inside America's most sacred military secret, and they had communicated that fact using a flawed code. The room goes cold. Gardner and his colleagues don't celebrate. They understand what this means. If one message can be read, so can others. And if more repeat keys exist, the entire corpus of Soviet diplomatic traffic years' worth might be vulnerable. They don't call the president. They don't arrest the spy. They do something far more dangerous. They start listening. And for the next 3 decades, the United States silently harvests secrets from behind the Iron Curtain, watching as the Soviet Union whispers its most classified thoughts into a wiretap that never speaks back. Moscow, meanwhile, carries on with the confidence of the unobserved. KGB handlers report back to center. Soviet embassies pulse with encrypted traffic. Operation after operation moves forward without ever realizing that each code sent across the Atlantic lands, not in a vacuum, but into the lap of a silent, sleepless machine. And when the truth finally reaches the KGB's top leadership, decades later, it doesn't land as a report. It lands as panic. Because by then, America has not just cracked a code, it has rewritten the limits of Cold War intelligence and left a deep scar in the Soviet soul. In Moscow, the KGB's cryptographic division operated like a priesthood. It was called the 8th Department of the 1st Chief Directorate, responsible for cipher systems used by embassies, consulates, and intelligence handlers abroad. Their primary tool, the one-time pad. To Soviet leadership, it was the closest thing to perfection ever devised in the science of secrecy. The one-time pad was theoretically unbreakable. Each message was encrypted using a random string of numbers, known only to sender and receiver. These number sets' keys were used once, then destroyed. If properly executed, no amount of analysis could decode the message. It wasn't a code. It was entropy weaponized. This doctrine wasn't just a technical position, it was a belief system. Soviet leaders placed their faith in the cipher's math like a shield. They assumed that as long as the codebooks were protected, no message could be read. It was a kind of cryptographic invincibility. Every diplomat, every spy, every agent operating undercover was wrapped in this assumption. But it was wrong, because the key principle, the use of a pad only once, was violated. In 1942, under wartime pressure, a Soviet cipher factory in Leningrad duplicated several sets of one-time pad pages to speed up production. Thousands of messages sent from New York, Washington, and San Francisco used reused keys without the operators realizing. It was a logistical shortcut that would crack open Soviet secrets for the next 40 years. The Americans didn't know right away. But once Meredith Gardner uncovered a reused key in 1946, the signal's intelligence community pounced. With time, patience, and linguistic expertise, they began identifying patterns. Names, locations, slang, rank designations. Every detail they decoded became a tool to decode the next. Back in Moscow, the KGB's cipher office had no idea. They continued to operate under the assumption that the pad system was functioning perfectly. If an asset was compromised in the West, the explanation was assumed to be betrayal or surveillance, not a breach of the sacred cipher. Codebooks were still issued and distributed under the same security assumptions as before. Embassies were told to burn them only upon attack, never suspecting they had already failed. And the damage was cumulative. Every Soviet official who passed information using those duplicated pads was unknowingly betraying his mission. Every handler who used that channel to coordinate agents left behind a trail, not a direct transcript, but an echo the Americans could slowly rebuild. Over 3,000 messages, tens of thousands of encrypted groups, an entire diplomatic and espionage infrastructure laid bare by a single production error and a failure to imagine the consequences. The Soviet Union didn't lose its secrets in a single breach. It lost them in a room full of false certainties, protected by mathematics but undone by human shortcuts. And they wouldn't realize it until the end. The Soviet Union's intelligence doctrine was not just a tool of war, it was a worldview. At its core lay an unshakable belief that control of information, executed through deep cover agents, encrypted communication, and tight political oversight, could shape the world more powerfully than tanks or missiles. Soviet diplomats were not mere envoys, they were often dual-role operators, handling influence missions, coordinating espionage, and running covert assets across host nations. And all of it relied on the assumption that no one could read what they wrote. From the Lubyanka to Havana, from Berlin to New York, Soviet operatives spoke in encrypted language through cables, couriers, and transmissions that passed through layers of encoding. The entire mechanism of foreign influence, from agent recruitment to political subversion, depended on the invisibility provided by their codebooks. But in the shadows of Arlington Hall, that invisibility was slowly dissolving. The Americans weren't just listening, they were reconstructing the Soviet nervous system. Every decrypted message became a blood sample. Each confirmed identity turned into a map of infiltration. What had once been unknown, how the KGB categorized agents, communicated deadlines, or referenced operations, was now a growing linguistic and psychological library. Meanwhile, Soviet doctrine remained unchanged. There was no contingency for a world in which the Americans could read their internal traffic. There were protocols for traitors, for surveillance, even for bugging, but not for this, because to Soviet strategists, signals intelligence was something that happened to others. They saw the Americans as technically advanced but operationally clumsy, loud, visible, and overly dependent on technology. The idea that these same Americans were quietly mapping their most protected diplomatic and intelligence networks in real time was inconceivable. The irony was brutal. The KGB built one of the most feared human intelligence machines in the world, but it never believed the enemy would beat them at math. But that's what was happening. As more Soviet messages were decrypted, it became clear that the Americans weren't just identifying spies. They were tracking how Soviet influence worked, who funded what, which agents were expendable, which messages were prioritized, and how orders moved from Moscow to the field. This wasn't just tactical exposure. It was doctrinal dissection, and the Soviets had no idea. They believed they were acting from behind a wall. They believed their every move was invisible. But the wall had cracks, and those cracks were about to shatter the foundation beneath their entire foreign intelligence strategy. On the 31st of July, 1946, a team at Arlington Hall decrypted a partial Soviet diplomatic cable that changed everything. The message was mundane in format, sent from the Soviet consulate in New York to Moscow, filled with typical internal designators. But as analysts pieced together the plain text using duplicated one-time pads, a name surfaced. Persian. It wasn't a location. It was a code name. The context suggested access to atomic secrets. Then came another. Quantum. Followed by a phrase that made no sense at first. Delivery successful. Agent embedded in scientific team reports progress. Within hours, American counterintelligence realized what they were looking at. This wasn't just a spy report. It was confirmation that the Soviet Union had a source inside the Manhattan Project, America's most secret, most protected wartime endeavor. At first, no one believed it. The Manhattan Project's security had been airtight, or so they thought. But a separate counter-espionage program under the FBI, already investigating leaks, cross-referenced the decrypted message with known internal suspicions. The pieces aligned. Persian referred to Klaus Fuchs, a German-born British physicist who had worked at Los Alamos and passed critical nuclear weapons data to the Soviets. Quantum likely referred to the broader espionage network around him. The F-111 of code-breaking had just launched its first strike. But the real blow wasn't the content of the message, it was its timing. The message had been sent in 1944. It was decrypted in 1946. A 2-year delay. The damage had already been done. Fuchs had continued his work, passed data, and gone undetected. By the time his name emerged from the Venona decrypts, it was too late to prevent the leak. But it wasn't too late to begin a war of shadows. That same year, the United States initiated one of the most secret intelligence operations in its history, Venona. A joint effort between the Army's Signal Intelligence Service and later the NSA, Venona became a long-term project to decrypt thousands of Soviet messages using compromised one-time pad traffic. The goal wasn't just to catch spies, it was to map an empire's secrets from the inside. Over the next decades, Venona would identify Soviet agents inside the U.S. government, research institutions, and media. It would track how Moscow directed its global intelligence machine and how deeply it had penetrated Western democracies. But it all began with this message, a few hundred characters, a reused cipher pad, and the realization that the unbreakable Soviet wall wasn't impenetrable after all. It was already leaking. The warning signs were there. Throughout the 1,950 seconds, whispers trickled back to Moscow. Double agents hinted that U.S. counterintelligence operations were unusually accurate. Several Soviet assets in the West were arrested under suspiciously precise circumstances, and by 1953, it was no longer coincidence. American intelligence knew far too much. Inside Lubyanka, the headquarters of the KGB, the implications were staggering. Had the Americans cracked their ciphers? Impossible. The very idea was dismissed outright. The Soviet response was rooted in ideology. The one-time pad was invulnerable. That wasn't conjecture, it was mathematical certainty. So when reports came from field agents warning that something was wrong with their communications, senior KGB officers interpreted the breach not as a code failure, but as human weakness, defection, betrayal, espionage. The KGB launched internal investigations, ordered surveillance of their own cipher clerks, and increased vetting of diplomatic staff. They even interrogated agents returning from posts in the U.S., suspecting moles among their ranks. But they never touched the cipher system, because to question the one-time pad was to question the core theology of Soviet security doctrine. Instead of reworking their encryption protocols, they doubled down. Cipher departments were told to tighten procedures, to issue fewer keys, and to improve courier security. But they still operated under the same assumption, that any breach was human, not structural. The Americans, meanwhile, said nothing. They continued decrypting, continued mapping the web, continued watching, as KGB officials made decisions based on the belief that their secrets were safe. Each decrypted message was another trap sprung without a sound. This wasn't just about encryption, it was about psychology. By refusing to believe their codes had been compromised, Soviet leadership protected their pride and doomed their networks. Every message sent over a compromised pad was a confession one read only by the enemy. Eventually, some whispers reached the Kremlin. Soviet agents learned that their American counterparts spoke with unusual confidence. Some even confronted handlers, asking whether the codebooks were compromised. One senior KGB officer's response was chilling in hindsight. "If they're reading us, we'd already be dead." But that was the mistake. The Americans didn't strike. They didn't expose. They just listened. And for a generation, the Soviet Union made strategic decisions based on a belief that their enemies were blind when in fact, They were watching from the inside out. By the late 1950 seconds, the KGB could no longer ignore the disturbing trend. Soviet agents in the West were being exposed with uncanny precision. Code names were compromised, meeting locations intercepted, entire spy networks unraveled seemingly overnight. Yet the one-time pad system still appeared flawless. No tampering, no theft, no confirmed breaches. So the KGB formed a new theory. There was a mole. Someone, somewhere, deep within the Soviet intelligence apparatus, had to be leaking information to the Americans. It couldn't be the ciphers. The mathematics didn't allow it, so it had to be betrayal. The search began. Internal surveillance increased. Cipher clerks were rotated more frequently. Psychological evaluations became more aggressive. Entire units of the First Chief Directorate were placed under suspicion. Officers reported on one another. Loyalty was scrutinized more than performance. And through it all, the real breach went untouched. Back in the United States, the Venona project continued decoding Soviet cables. The analysts at Arlington Hall and later Fort Meade weren't spies. They were mathematicians, linguists, and logicians. But their discoveries were turning Soviet intelligence inside out without ever leaving their desks. The KGB's misplaced focus created a paralysis of paranoia. Efforts to root out the imaginary mole consumed resources. Missions were delayed. Recruitment slowed. Cipher upgrades were deprioritized. After all, if the mole was the problem, then the cipher wasn't. And if the cipher wasn't the problem, why change it? It was a recursive loop fed by arrogance and fear. One particular irony stood out. Several of the very agents who had been unmasked through Venona were accused of being the leak, interrogated, imprisoned, in some cases executed. The real cause of their exposure, mathematical pattern recognition, was never suspected, and so the cycle repeated. Each failure reinforced the wrong conclusion. Each arrest fueled the wrong purge. Each breach widened the real hole. Meanwhile, on the American side, restraint ruled. Venona decrypts weren't acted on recklessly. They were used to build long-term profiles, cross-referenced with human intelligence, and deployed only when operational gains outweighed the risk of revealing the breach. This allowed Venona to survive far longer than it should have, because while the Soviets hunted ghosts, the Americans harvested reality. The wrong theory didn't just blind the KGB. It made them complicit in their own undoing. As the 1960 seconds unfolded, Soviet analysts began noticing something stranger than mere coincidence. Certain diplomatic initiatives failed before they even began. Friendly regimes became hostile. Propaganda efforts unraveled. Key targets changed behavior just days after Moscow issued instructions. To the KGB, it was no longer enough to blame a mole. This pattern suggested something deeper. A theory took hold. The Americans had a defector pipeline. They believed U.S. intelligence was being fed by a rotating stream of turncoats, Soviet operatives or friendly foreign agents who were feeding Washington live copies of encrypted messages. This was comforting in a perverse way. It meant the cipher still worked. The breach was temporary. If the defectors could be caught or silenced, the network could be repaired. The machine would function again. So the KGB launched counter-defector campaigns. They fed disinformation into live diplomatic cables, false meeting locations, fake agent names, dummy operations. Then, they waited to see how the Americans reacted. If a cable said, "Meet in Prague," and the Prague contact vanished, that would prove the Americans had human sources. Sometimes it worked. Often it didn't. Because the Americans weren't reacting. They were collecting. The Venona decrypts weren't used for day-to-day disruption. They were part of a long-term strategy to map the entire Soviet espionage system, track communication patterns, identify agents by code names, and use that intelligence in ways that would never point back to the breach. The Soviets, misreading the silence, assumed the messages were unread, and they kept sending them. In one decrypted cable from 1945, The KGB instructed its Washington station to increase penetration of the U.S. State Department. Another ordered contacts to secure atomic research from Canadian facilities. Each message included code names, logistics, and movement details. Each one landed in American hands without a single defector involved. But in Moscow, the defector theory hardened into doctrine. Training was revised. Counterintelligence teams were expanded. Even trusted assets were rotated prematurely to minimize leak windows. The result? Chaos. Operations suffered from instability. Field agents grew paranoid. Missions were botched not by American interference but by Soviet overcorrection, all because the KGB couldn't imagine a world where the cipher itself had been mathematically compromised. They were fighting ghosts again, and the Americans, still decrypting, still building dossiers, watched it all unfold. The second wrong theory didn't just mislead Soviet intelligence, it eroded its confidence. And in a war of secrets, that was sometimes more dangerous than defeat. By the early 1970 seconds, the Venona project had quietly unraveled one of the most sophisticated spy networks in modern history. From Washington to London, from Canberra to Paris, decrypted Soviet cables had exposed not just isolated agents, but entire systems of espionage. These weren't amateurs, these were highly placed, deeply embedded operatives, government officials, journalists, scientists. In some cases, they were advisors to heads of state, and the KGB never saw it coming. Venona decrypts had identified at least 349 Soviet agents, many operating under false nationalities, embedded in defense departments, atomic research labs, and diplomatic circles. Some were arrested quietly. Others were turned into double agents. Many more were simply neutralized by silent disruption, promotions denied, roles reassigned, or operations subtly dismantled before they began. But the most devastating decision was strategic. The Americans never told the world. They didn't go public with the fact that they had cracked Soviet diplomatic codes. They didn't use it for propaganda. They didn't even tell most of their own government, because the value of Venona wasn't in the arrests. It was in the invisibility. As long as the Soviets believed their codes were secure, they kept using them. And with every cable, the Americans built a deeper, more nuanced understanding of how the Soviet Union ran its covert operations. It wasn't just about catching spies, it was about predicting behavior. American analysts began to anticipate Soviet moves in Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America, not because of satellite imagery or intercepted phone calls, but because Venona revealed how the KGB thought, how it prioritized missions, how it reacted to setbacks, how it weighed diplomatic consequences against ideological gains. The project turned Soviet intelligence into a readable psychological map, and then came the final irony. Even when the Soviets started to suspect something was wrong, they lacked the evidence to confirm it. They chased moles, tested agents, even considered scrapping entire cipher systems. But without knowing that it was a production flaw in reused one-time pads, long since destroyed, they had no way to trace the breach. It was the perfect crime, and for American intelligence, it was the most valuable operation of the Cold War. But even perfection has its limits. By the late 1970 seconds, the stream of decryptable Soviet messages slowed. The compromised pads had been exhausted. Newer Soviet encryption systems, more carefully managed, began replacing the flawed ones. The window was closing. Venona was eventually shut down in 1980. Its impact, however, was seismic. Without fanfare, without headlines, and without ever exposing its full scope, the project reshaped counterintelligence doctrine across the Western world, and left the KGB grasping for answers it would never find. Venona wasn't an accident. It was a system, a cold, deliberate engine of intelligence collection forged in silence, built not on luck, but on persistence, mathematics, and organizational discipline. At its heart was a simple idea: listen longer than they expect. And the Americans did exactly that. From a few repeated keys in 1946 They constructed an entire ecosystem of code breaking that would outlast the very assumptions the Soviet Union was built upon. Unlike Soviet intelligence, which favored central command, rigid ideology, and human-heavy operations, the Americans chose something quieter, something recursive, something that learned with every message it touched. It started with a handful of people at Arlington Hall, Meredith Gardner among them, linguists fluent in obscure Russian idioms, cryptanalysts with a gambler's patience, and mathematicians who knew the difference between randomness and repetition. Then came the linguistics. With each decrypted cable, Venona analysts built glossaries of Soviet phrases, terms like line X, scientific intelligence, or line PR, political intelligence. These weren't just vocabulary. They were keys to institutional logic. The Americans were mapping Soviet thinking from the inside out. And it grew. By the 1950 seconds, the National Security Agency, NSA, had taken over Venona operations. Massive IBM punch card systems and custom-built sorting machines were brought online to automate frequency analysis and partial key reconstruction. Computers, still in their infancy, were trained to detect cipher anomalies. It wasn't artificial intelligence, but it was automated intuition. And crucially, it was compartmentalized. Most U.S. officials never knew Venona existed. Only a handful of FBI and CIA officers had access. Arrests based on Venona were always backed by separate evidence, ensuring the Soviets could never confirm the source. Even when exposed, the spies were rarely told how they were caught. This allowed Venona to function for over 3 decades without exposure. But the true genius of the system wasn't just technical. It was strategic silence. Where the KGB measured success in operations launched, the Americans measured success in insight accumulated. Venona wasn't about stopping every mission. It was about seeing the machine. Who answered to whom? Who got priority clearance? What time a Moscow center message was likely to arrive? Which embassies were forwarding intelligence, and which were receiving orders? It was chess with invisible pieces, and America had the board memorized. This also transformed American counterintelligence. The FBI shifted from reactive arrests to long-term cultivation. Suspected spies were watched, manipulated, or misled. Missions were allowed to proceed just far enough to confirm broader networks. The CIA, armed with Venona insights, recalibrated its own agent recruitment. They didn't just need spies, they needed context. Venona gave them that alive diagram of how Soviet doctrine adapted under pressure. Even in the field, this invisible knowledge shaped everything. In Vietnam, Latin America, and Africa, Soviet influence was often countered not with firepower, but with pre-positioned awareness. Because the U.S. already knew which advisors were coming, which playbook they were running, which agents were behind the curtain, and all of it traced back to a repeated number sequence in a Soviet cipher pad. Venona was not a miracle. It was proof that in a war of secrets, the side that listens longer wins. It took over 3 decades, but the reckoning finally came. In 1980, the last Venona decrypt was processed. The Soviet pads produced in wartime haste had all been used. The flow of compromised messages dried up, but by then, the damage had already metastasized into history. And in Moscow, the truth surfaced like a slow-moving detonation. A Soviet defector in Western Europe confirmed American access to diplomatic cables. Not rumors, not speculation. He gave details, dates, keywords, names of exposed agents. When that report hit the Lubyanka, it landed like a body blow. KGB chairman Yuri Andropov, already known for his hardline approach, demanded a full audit of Soviet cipher operations, stretching back to the 1940 seconds. What they found was unthinkable. Codebooks had been duplicated. Pad sequences had been reused systematically, unknowingly, fatally. The KGB, which had prided itself as the most secure intelligence agency on Earth, realized it had been running with its vault doors wide open for decades. Every operation, every cable, Every agent might have been compromised, and worse, they would never know which ones. The internal response was panic. Diplomatic protocols were rewritten overnight. Cipher machines were replaced. Key generation factories were overhauled. Thousands of old cables were reviewed retroactively. Former cipher officers were interrogated. Burn bags were triple-checked. Courier networks restructured. Whole decades of global espionage were treated as contaminated, and still, no fix could rewind the breach. In Washington, the U.S. intelligence community said nothing. No press conferences, no leaks, no celebration, because silence had always been Venona's greatest strength. But the Soviets understood humiliation when they saw it. They had lost the Cold War's deepest battle without ever engaging in open combat. Their pride, the unbreakable one-time pad, had been broken by American civilians sitting in a converted girls' school outside D.C., and the effect wasn't just institutional. It was psychological. KGB officers no longer trusted their own systems. Field operatives began questioning the very messages they received. Was this cable compromised? Was my handler followed? Do the Americans know I'm coming? For an intelligence agency built on fear, self-doubt was lethal. Worse still, the damage spread beyond the KGB. The Soviet Ministry of Foreign Affairs began purging staff. GRU field operations were disrupted. Embassies recalled entire teams under suspicion of lax security. The Politburo demanded answers that no one could give, because there was no traitor to punish, no facility to bomb, no algorithm to crack. The Americans had done something far more devastating. They had listened, for 30 years, without ever telling a soul. Venona didn't just defeat a spy network. It dismantled the illusion of invulnerability, and the Soviet machine, so reliant on secrecy, ideology, and operational momentum, was forced to stare into the abyss of its own exposed silence. When the Soviets finally acknowledged, behind closed doors, that the Americans had penetrated their diplomatic communications for more than 30 years, it triggered more than panic. It triggered ideological collapse. For the KGB, and by extension, the Soviet state, the idea of operational omniscience was central. They weren't just observers of the world, they were manipulators of it. They believed history bent, not through conflict alone, but through information. Moved by whispers in embassies, shifted by directives sent through secure lines, controlled through secrets exchanged in code. And now they had to face the truth. For decades, those secure lines were wiretapped by mathematics. Their secrets weren't theirs. Their influence operations were exposed. Their ambassadors, diplomats, and deep-cover agents all operated inside a theater where the audience had the script. To Soviet strategic planners, this wasn't just an intelligence failure. It was doctrinal annihilation. The entire structure of Soviet covert diplomacy had been based on the inviolability of communications. If the Americans had been reading messages from Havana, from Rome, from Delhi, then what decisions had been made on the basis of compromised operations? Which wars were supported? Which revolutions funded? Which deals cut on false assumptions of secrecy? It became unanswerable, and with that, the quiet collapse began. Internally, trust in cipher reliability was broken. Plans that required precision timing were shelved. Agent networks were left dormant. Missions once considered routine were viewed as potential traps. The KGB, which once struck terror across continents, began turning inward, obsessed with its own rot. Strategically, the USSR became reactive. Where it once launched aggressive foreign political campaigns, now it waited, unsure, watching for shadows. And ideologically, this was the real fracture. The belief that socialism could outthink and outmaneuver capitalist decay through superior information control began to fracture. If capitalist math had pierced socialist silence, what other myths were broken? The irony was inescapable. For years, Soviet propaganda had mocked American imperialism as brutish, blind, militaristic. Yet the Americans had sat in silence, without fire or fanfare, and cracked the core of the Soviet spy state without ever needing to fire a shot. The damage wasn't just operational, it was existential. The KGB's foundation, its myth of control, its narrative of infallibility, was now just that, a myth, a whisper in a wire, read by the enemy, ignored by history, but never forgotten by those who once believed their codes were unbreakable. Venona was never meant to be known. For decades, it existed in shadows, its files buried in classified vaults, its analysts retiring in silence. No medals, no headlines, no speeches. Only in 1995, 14 years after the Cold War effectively ended, did the U.S. government declassify the Venona project. What emerged wasn't just a list of spies. It was a map of Cold War reality, revealing how deeply the Soviet Union had infiltrated the West and how completely that network had been read. But by then, the world had changed. The Soviet Union was gone. The Berlin Wall was rubble. The Lubyanka files had been thrown into chaos. And somewhere in Moscow, in a dark archive no one spoke of, KGB veterans flipped through documents bearing code names they once believed were invisible. Gone were the certainties. Gone was the confidence. What remained was a haunting realization. Their Cold War adversary hadn't just outspent or outgunned them, it had outweighted them, outlistened them, outthought them. Today, Venona is a footnote in American history, a classified success, often overshadowed by flashier victories. But to Soviet-era intelligence veterans, it remains a phantom pain, a ghost embedded in every operation that once relied on the sanctity of ciphered text. The very silence of Venona is what made it devastating, because it didn't crash through walls. It sat inside the walls, invisible, patient, merciless. Even now, the lessons echo. In cybersecurity, in encryption wars, in debates about quantum computing and surveillance, the legacy of Venona lingers, not in the tools, but in the trust we place in them, because what the Soviets learned too late is that no cipher is sacred, and no system is safe from silence. The ghost of the Cold War doesn't live in missile silos or parade grounds. It lives in codebooks, in messages long sent, in voices never heard but always recorded, and in the quiet realization, felt too late, that the enemy was already inside.